Owning your own home has always been the Australian dream. But for a lot of young people, that's all it's ever going to be, a dream. And a speech by the Grattan Institute's Brendan Coates recently is quite revealing. He points out that over the 40 years to 2021, home ownership rates among that key 25 to 34-year-old bracket fell from over 60% to just 40%. And when you get down to the lowest paid 40% of that age group, it's more than halved. Quite frankly, I feel a great sense of loss about this. Owning a home is meant to be something achievable in this country. Joining me now to discuss it is Brendan Coates from the Grattan Institute. Brendan, thank you for your time. Are we now a nation of renters?
No, we're not a nation of renters. The majority of people, more than half of Australians, are likely to own their own home. But amongst sort of lower income Australians, those that are earning below median income of say $60,000, $70,000 a year, then increasingly renting is going to be a part of life, not just when people are young, when they're, going around doing a trade, going to university, starting out their working lives, but increasingly when they've got kids, when they've got kids going through school and increasingly into retirement. And that's where it should really worry us, is actually the falling rates of home ownership of people approaching retirement today. Because we know that if you don't own your own home by the time you retire, your risk of poverty is just so much higher than amongst homeowners.
Well, that's actually a really good point, because I think the flexibility of renting when you're a young person, you don't know about where you're going to be with jobs and travel and various other things, where you're going to settle. But what are the consequences if we become a nation or we have a lot of people who don't have the security of a permanent home in which to live through their retirement years or even the latter working years? That's got to have an impact on us societally, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we take, working families that have got kids as the first one, like we know that stability is critically important there, because that's a time when you've got, kids going to childcare, kids going to school, the local public school around the corner. You've also, if you're in a major city, you're also trying to commute into the city or to commute elsewhere to try to work. And so you need that stability to be able to essentially mean that you can stay in that home and know that you can be secure there. And if you have to move, particularly if you have to move because of your landlord, then you find yourself potentially experiencing quite a lot of stress because you've got to upend your life. So that's probably the one in the short term where it's playing out more, is that more and more younger people are having families, having kids and living in rental accommodation. But at the other end of life, we know that roughly half of retirees that rent today are in poverty relative compared to, much less than 10% of retirees otherwise that are in home ownership. And that points to the fact that rent's expensive. People are spending 30, 40, up to 50% of their income on housing. That's incredibly expensive. And what that means is they have relatively little left over for other essentials. And so we see really high rates of financial stress and poverty amongst older Australians that are renting. And as home ownership is really hollowed out for lower and middle income Australians, we're seeing home ownerships falling not just at that 25 to 34-year-old category that you're talking about, Cory, but also in their 30s and their 40s and into their 50s, and increasingly for middle income Australians. And so that just means fewer Australians own their own home in retirement, which is just a recipe for, a growing generation of older Australians in poverty.
All right, Brendan, I've got 30 seconds for your answer on this, but successive governments have tried to address housing affordability, home ownership. I made the point earlier on that everything they do fuels up the attractiveness of owning a home or two or three, and that makes it more unaffordable for those who are seeking to get into it. Ross Gitton's made that point in his column today. What should we do to address this problem?
Two things at the federal level. Like, we do have to scale back the tax concessions for things like the capital gains tax discount. That will help. That will boost rates of home ownership more than it will reduce house prices. But in the long run, if we're going to make a big difference, we've got to be building more homes to meet the needs of what is a growing population. That means trying to allow more housing to be built in the inner and middle ring suburbs of our major cities. Because without that, you're going to see rising rates of homelessness. We're going to see more people struggling to afford a home. And that just leaves us with a poorer Australia overall.
I agree with you 100% on that second point. Not so sure about the tax concessions, but we can talk about that another time. Brendan Coates, I really appreciate you coming on and joining me on Paul Murray Live.